forego questions. So, Dr. Burgess, you're recognized for questions.
Well, I want to thank both of our witnesses for being with us so late this evening. You've done such a great job with your presentations. I have no questions. I hope we pass an appropriate rule to allow your bill to come to the floor.
Thank you. I now recognize our distinguished ranking member for any questions he may have.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record the statement of administration. The SAP says, and I quote, "The administration strongly opposes H.R. 1163. Contrary to its stated purpose, this bill would strip state unemployment insurance programs of essential resources to fight fraud, combat identity theft, and recover overpayments, and would set back the goals of strengthening the program integrity and combating systemic fraud," end quote. It further says, and I quote, "If the President were presented with H.R. 1163, he would veto it," end quote. Mr. Davis, the Ways and Means Committee,
Without objection.
thank you, the Ways and Means Committee recently held a hearing on UI fraud. Does this bill address the policy recommendations made by the witnesses?
Thank you, Mr. McGovern. The recent Ways and Means hearing featured only Republican-invited witnesses. The bill does not address the following Republican witness recommendations. They were to provide adequate and consistent funding for state staffing and technology, or restore cuts to the Biden budget forced by Republicans. GAO, DOL, Inspector Generals, and the head of the Pandemic Unemployment Task Force fully fund investigations and prosecutions by the DOL Inspector General, clearly amend the criminal code to extend the statute of limitations for specific crimes during the pandemic to ensure that those who committed criminal fraud are brought to justice. These are from the DOL Inspector General. In fact, every expert we heard from at our full committee hearing said that the single most effective way to prevent future fraud would be to reliably, predictably, and adequately fund administration of the program so that states had functional technology and enough well-trained staff. This bill does not do that, and the Ways and Means Chair ruled that an amendment to address this recommendation as non-germane to the topic, showing a disdain for what is actually needed.
And let me ask you, what will the Department of Labor have to cut if the remaining $400 million in ARPA funding is rescinded?
Mr. McGovern, DOL is preparing to release about $200 million in state grants to fund best practices in fraud prevention, detection, and overpayment recovery, including ways to approach identity verification that balance the National Institute of Standards and Technology, that is NIST, which is Identity Verification Standards, with equitable access to benefits. DOL is also prepared to make substantial investments in state technology upgrades and using the funding to provide ongoing support to the Tiger teams that advise states on system improvement. Further eliminating the ARPA dollars also would put the DOL Inspector General's fraud investigation at risk in the future because DOL is using conditions of funding on ARPA grants to ensure that the Inspector General has access to state data needed for fraud investigations. The loss of the ARPA funds would likely make DOL unable to extend the grants, which means the Inspector General might lose access. At the beginning of the pandemic, the Trump Department of Labor refused to help the Inspector General get data access, forcing them to subpoena all the states and delaying investigations by several months.
Thank you. Chairman Smith, maybe I missed this in the opening. What kind of rule did you request? Did you request open rule, modified closed rule, or closed rule? What did you have? I didn't hear.
I would assume, since this is a revenue bill, this would be considered a closed rule.
Well, there's no magic rule that says because it's a revenue bill that
That's typically what the practice has
has to be the
been.
closed rule.
Can I chime in to
You
a
can say whatever you
statement
want to say.
that was made earlier? The witnesses that was at our hearing were all government witnesses. It was the GAO Comptroller General, it was the Department of Labor Inspector General, and it was the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee. Those were the three witnesses. They were government witnesses.
Do you consult with the ranking member about these witnesses, or do you just do it on your own?
I consult with the ranking member on all kinds of things.
But I mean, on these
Hearing was-
witnesses, I don't know. They may have been perfectly fine witnesses. I don't know.
believe
But I guess
Biden
the point he was
is
making,
president, which is your
the point
administration.
that he was making was that he did not, if I'm understanding Mr. Davis correctly, that the Democrats were not asked which witnesses that they would like to see.
And the money that's being pulled out is also unobligated COVID dollars, the $400 million. It has not been obligated by the Department of Labor. It's only unobligated funds.
Yeah, well, let me just make one final comment here. I mean, this has been a long day, and it's not over yet. It's going to continue to get longer. And we're dealing with two pieces of legislation that, if you're a betting person, aren't going to go anywhere because the president has veto threats against both of them. And it is a little bit frustrating to be dealing with both these bills right now when we do have a problem in this country. We heard a lot on the earlier panel about our security. Well, we have people dying of gun violence every day in this country. We have massacres happening every day in this country. We had a massacre that took place in Allen, Texas on Saturday, and not a word from anyone about that, or not a peep on what we're going to do about it. And we have this happen over and over and over again. And it just, at some point, we have to focus in on the people's business and solving problems that, quite frankly, we're going to have to come together on and figure out a way to deal with it. And it's also worth noting that on this day, while we're doing all of this and ignoring the gun violence in this country, a jury found that Donald Trump, the Republican frontrunner, liable for sexual abuse and defamation. On this same day, we find out that your Republican colleague, George Santos, if that's his real name, has been criminally charged by the Department of Justice. And, I mean, I will tell you, objective observers watching what we are doing have to be scratching their head and saying, what the hell is wrong with this place? In any event, I have no further questions. I yield back my time.
Thank you. I think